The speakers will set aside 10 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer questions, and we encourage you to ask questions throughout the hour by typing them in the chat box to everyone. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Matt Gosling is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Protagonist Therapeutics and was General Counsel of DepotMed for over a decade beforehand, where he had firsthand knowledge with shareholder activism and hostile takeover attempts. Prior to his service as an in-house General Counsel, Matt practiced as corporate securities and M&A lawyer at Heller Ehrman. Lawrence Elbaum is the co-head of Vinson and Elkins shareholder activism practice. He counsels senior management and boards of public companies with respect to shareholder activism, campaigns, and complex corporate governance matters, including advising clients concerning proxy fights, merger contests, consent solicitations, withhold the vote or vote no campaigns, proposals and short attacks. Over the course of Lawrence's leadership of the shareholder activism practice in the last 5 years, the team has defended over 130 activism situations and has been ranked the top firm for shareholder activism defense for companies and board representation by Refinitiv, Activist Insight, and FactSet. Michael Charlson is co-chair of Vinson and Elkins shareholder litigation and enforcement practice. His practice focuses securities class action, corporate governance, and shareholder derivative litigation and related counseling. And he also handles complex litigation matters across a range of substantive areas. Michael provides litigation and D&O insurance support for the shareholder activism practice, and he has also represented companies and individuals before the SEC, including SEC investigations and enforcement proceedings involving allegations of insider trading, including tipper and tippee allegations, improper accounting, inadequate disclosure, improper supervision, and books and records violations. Now I'd like to turn it over to our presenters. Thank you.
Well, good morning. This is Michael Charlson, and I'm going to be moving the slides today, but we're going to start out by talking a little bit about shareholder activism in the current activism landscape, some of the stages of activism fight, how a company, and then also talk about how a company can prepare in advance for the possibility of such a fight. I'll turn it over to Lawrence Elbaum to get started.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Matt. And thank you to the association for having us today. We appreciate it, and we really value the partnership opportunities that we continue to work on together. So let's start with an introduction to shareholder activism. Can you advance to the next slide? So when we talk about shareholder activism, we're typically talking about three different types, but although they're separated into different boxes or spheres on this slide, every single campaign is a combination of one of these buckets. Social activism, you're hearing about more and more these days, but that's when shareholders are trying to promote certain social, political, or environmental goals through their investment and through their investment thesis. Less polluting, more gender and ethnic diversity on the board, less contaminants in the supply chain, less screen or tablet time for children, said an activist and CalSTRS to Apple several years ago. Those are examples of shareholders using social issues to advance the quality of their investment thesis. Governance activism, that's where shareholders are focused on what are called best practices for board composition and the makeup and composition of committees on a board. These also go to the charters that make up every single committee on the board, and also go to a host of corporate governance practices, such as are directors elected by a majority or a plurality, Do directors have to resign if they don't get a majority of votes cast at a meeting? Sometimes these issues are raised by activists. Is your board elected entirely on an annual basis, or are they elected only 1/3 of a board at a time, or a classified board every year, such that it's tougher for a shareholder to get control over a board? These are governance issues that typically come up in activism campaigns, but economic activism is truly, at the end of the day, what modern shareholder activism for proxy fights or against or for corporate actions or M&A. It's all based in economic activism. And at the end of the day, the activists that we're going to be discussing here are focused on unlocking value. If an activist does not have an economic thesis, it's very rare for an activist hedge fund to run a campaign purely on governance and social issues. There are pension funds out there that do that, but they do that for different reasons. BlackRock, of course, writes a letter every year through Larry Fink dealing with social and governance issues, and they are the thought leaders in that particular area. But BlackRock is not a shareholder activist. When we're talking about activist hedge funds, there has to be an economic thesis to unlock value. Is there cash on the balance sheet that should be distributed to shareholders? Is there an M&A strategy that hasn't been explored that should be explored? Should the company be sold? Oftentimes that is the strategy that the activist wants, because it's the easiest way for them to unlock quick value, 10, 20, 30% premium on their investment basis. Now, once an activist has figured out what their economic thesis is, then you will start to see the social and governance buckets come into play. Every single campaign now every economic campaign rather is wrapped in a host of social and governance issues. And sometimes the campaign is the exact right place for them. Sometimes they're a red herring, but the activists know, just like the companies do, that the social and governance issues resonate with the shareholders, who are, at the end of the day, the ones responsible for electing the next board of directors to run the company. So on this slide, at the end of the day, we call a proxy fight for board seats. It's a contested election. We call it a battle for control. It's no different than the Raiders from the 80s and the early 90s. In fact, you'll see on a subsequent slide that some of the Raiders from the 80s and 90s, like Icahn and Peltz and Singer, they've reinvented themselves as shareholder advocates. But oftentimes the goal to get the company sold is the same. But in the 80s and 90s, where hostile takeover was the theme, raiding was the theme, that's now given way to shareholder advocacy, unlocking value for the rest of shareholders, and taking a small stake in a company, but having that give way to a major corporate event, very similar to a raid that would end in a take private, except the buyer of the company is often different. Next slide, please. We alluded to this already. This is just an interesting comic depicting raiders from the 80s and 90s and what modern shareholder activism is. It's just a rebranding. Next slide, please. Otherwise known as the mugshot slide, these are your celebrity activists. It's possible that some of you on this call, including Matt, our panelist, have dealt with some of these activists before. You might see your company's names on here. I noted earlier that Carl Icahn and Paul Singer and Nelson Peltz, they were the Raiders, but they've reinvented themselves. Carl Icahn's even put on a nice beard and wears sweaters when he goes on TV now, and looks extremely approachable and not nearly as threatening as he was. But oftentimes his goals are exactly the same. We've had to deal with every single one of these activists at least once a year for the past 5 or 6 years. These are very sophisticated activists. Oftentimes it's very important to hear them out and to not give them the sharp elbow when they approach. It's a better way to find a path to a winning resolution. But let's turn to the next slide. This is just a short list of other known activists. We can give you one that's 10 times as long. There are many other activists besides the celebrities out there. There are first timers. There are very small funds. There are long-term shareholders that want out. There are founding shareholders that want out. And there are private companies that are dipping their toes in the water, and private equity funds that are now changing their limited partnership agreements to allow for activism. So this list is a modest list in comparison to the list of activists that we're dealing with on a regular basis. I'm sure many of you or your IR functions have received phone calls from these activists. What's the activist toolkit at the end of the day? We spoke about governance already, so let me just focus on the first three here. M&A is oftentimes the economic thesis that the activist is pursuing. Why? It's the fastest way for the activist to make a nice return on their investment. When that is not possible, you'll see the activists start talking about balance sheet operational issues. In terms of balance sheet activism, if you have a lot of cash on your balance sheet and your balance sheet is pretty lazy, an activist may say, hey, I have a good idea. Why don't you buy back some stock, including mine, and buy it back at a premium? Activists may also say, although they'll have to pay taxes, pay a special dividend with all the cash that you have on your balance sheet. If you don't have cash on your balance sheet and M&A is not a possibility, then you might start hearing about operational activism. This oftentimes you hear about in much larger companies where the activists are a bit more patient. These are longer campaigns where an activist like Nelson Peltz will actually have himself and a few other folks propose to come on the board and help you think about spinning off a business or help you think about transforming a brick and mortar business to an e-commerce business or merging two giant financial institutions together. The reason you don't see a lot of activism that's focused on operations is because it takes a lot of time. And remember, initially, we mentioned that activists are looking for a quick return on their investment. And one of the best tools against activists is to actually go to an activist and say, you have great ideas. Do you want to come sit on our audit committee and help us work through some of these operational issues? You'll get a no, because the last thing most of these activists want to do is actually roll up their sleeves and get locked up inside your boardroom, because then they can't trade out of the stock. But if you're hearing about operational activism, that might be a signal that the activist is going to be around longer than just 6 to 9 months.
So Matt, when you were at DepoMed, which of these themes was raised by your friends at Starboard?
Yeah, Michael, it was certainly the M&A was the theme, because we had in the summer and fall of 2015 been the subject of a hostile takeover attempt from another company that was unsuccessful. So then in the spring of 2016, Starboard took a position, and the theme was generally our sort of unwillingness to engage in that hostile takeover process. But obviously it all sort of blended together over the months that followed.
Right, blending together is pretty common. Let's look a bit at the current activism landscape and see how things are looking as we approach the 2021 proxy season. Lawrence?
Sure. Well, this is a hockey stick chart for the most part. It doesn't look like much of a hockey stick, but if you look at the past 15, 16, 17 years, activism is basically tripled, and depending on where your starting point is, it's quadrupled. Last year, even in the midst of a pandemic, there were more campaigns announced, at least according to FactSet. There's some other ranking systems that counted less campaigns, but according to FactSet, we have never seen this many campaigns launched in any given calendar year since 2003. I think that's pretty remarkable. A lot of campaigns slinked away last year We think they're going to come back around this year. The interesting thing about this chart is that 280 campaigns last year, that means a public letter, a filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission that the activist owns more than 5% of the stock and intends to influence the board. But a relatively small amount of those, nearly 100, ended up becoming actual proxy contests. That means that about 200 of these matters got resolved, which is a high proportion of matters getting resolved. Normally, we see more matters go to proxy fights. And what's the difference between a campaign and a proxy fight? A proxy fight is where the activist actually makes formal nominations to the company's board or makes a fight against a public M&A announcement. There still were a number of those last year, close to 100, but a lot of matters settled or slinked away. Many activists didn't want to seem opportunistic or vulturistic. They didn't know how bad the pandemic was going to get. But the very interesting statistic here is what's not here. It's the 100 or 150 campaigns that are not picked up by FactSet because there are no public letters, because there are no public securities filings. Those are the campaigns that don't see the light of day. Those are the phone calls that you get from an activist screaming at you, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, we're going to run a fight. And the company manages to negotiate it away with the activist. Those are our biggest victories, making activism go away without any public affair whatsoever, without any settlement, without any fighting. There's probably another 120 to 150 campaigns like that every year. And if you add those to the 280 campaigns that are reflected on this chart, that's about 400 campaigns, which is about 10% of public company America. That's a high proportion of companies getting hit with activism. That means for every 10 companies on this conference call, on this Zoom call, at least one of you is going to have to deal with a form of activism or another in the coming calendar year. This chart speaks for itself. Many more large companies nowadays are becoming the target of activism, but the vast majority of proxy fights, the campaigns that mature into formal nominations, are at much smaller companies under $1 billion in market cap. Why? The bigger companies tend not to want to be in the public arena. These fights can be long, drawn out, mudslinging, and they tend to settle, maybe not faster, but they settle short of these matters becoming a public affair. Now, companies that are smaller in size, they'll tend to have the courage to fight for their convictions, particularly if they're not in a major metropolitan market where they're going to be in the news every single day about their fight. Next slide. Again, most fights nowadays are for less than a majority of the board. Most activists do not go for board control. You could see the statistics were pretty consistent between 19 and 20. The reason is because ISS and Glass Lewis, I'm sure you're all aware of the role ISS and Glass Lewis play in voting for shareholders in corporate America, but they don't like to give the keys away to the kingdom to an activist. It's a lot easier for activists to convince ISS and Glass Lewis and BlackRock and Vanguard and Fidelity to give a few seats on the board under a what's the harm argument. Now, there are a lot of great defenses to that, but it's a lot easier for an activist to get a few seats than to get a majority. On the next slide. So the importance of ISS and Glass Lewis, and Michael, you could just show the next slide as well. ISS and Glass Lewis are mixed, despite what the headlines might say on these slides. The data, there's not enough data. ISS and Glass Lewis don't weigh in on enough proxy fights every single year to have a sample size big enough to start making predictions of how your company is going to do. You need to win ISS and Glass Lewis in a contested situation. It's a form of insurance to make sure that your institutional shareholders vote for you. But Matt, having sat in the seat of boards and management teams asking you to explain why ISS and Glass Lewis are ruining everyone's lives. Just kidding. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how that intersected with your role as counsel to management and the board?
Yeah, certainly we had, advisors like you, Lawrence, and a proxy advisor who sort of studied very closely our shareholders and the extent to which they follow or don't follow ISS or Glass Lewis, or whether they sort of go out on their own. So, the expectation regarding what ISS and Glass Lewis would do was very important and figured pretty significantly into, the way we at Diplomat approached the situation with Starboard. So it's definitely this and everything else associated with these situations. You want to get very competent advisors, which thankfully we have.
The one thing I would say is that from my observations, exactly what ISS and Glass Lewis are going to say is hard to predict, and they often get it wrong. I mean, they send out reports that frankly just get things wrong. And so, this is a piece, but not the entire strategy, as we're going to discuss.
Well, most proxy fights, like I said, you don't get a lot of ISS and Glass Lewis data because most of these fights get resolved. Why? Well, if a company is winning, getting close to the vote or getting close to the ISS and Glass Lewis meeting, the activist will typically pack up their bags and go home. They'll probably send out a press release taking a victory lap for whatever achievements they've made to date, and they tell the company, we're gonna keep watching you. We're gonna keep a close eye on you. However, if ISS and Glass Lewis give support to the activist, the shareholder vote looks good. Michael and I and Matt, when he was dealing with this with Starboard, you'll get a phone call, and it's a weird phone call. Hey, we're winning, but we want to settle with you. Now that doesn't normally happen in a litigation context, but it happens in the activism context a lot. So remember, earlier we said activists typically go after less than a majority of the board. So they know that if they get 3 out of 9 board seats, after a very hostile fight, they have to start to begin to mend fences so that they're not in the minority in a corner, cloaked and with having nothing to do on the board. If they settle with the company, they now can help the company save face, embarrassing loss averted, and they can settle, and the activist can get things like designation on committees. They can maybe get another board title. Maybe they could get other resignations from the board in exchange as well. If 3 directors out of 9 join the board, good luck getting committees right away. That board, after a nasty fight, is probably going to want to wait some time to get comfortable with the activists, designees, before giving them significant jobs on the board. That could take time. Through a settlement, it can get ordained. Another reason that activists want to settle is they want to get expense reimbursement. Their expenses for proxy fights come out of their own pockets, doesn't come out of their LP's pockets, and these can be very expensive. It can cost activists up to a few $1 million to run a proxy fight all the way to the end. And a company's board can, as part of a settlement, reimburse the activist. Now, the dirty little secret is that settlement payment might be insurable under the company's D&O insurance policy, in which case they're getting peace from the activist and the insurance company is paying for it. That's the topic of a whole different CLE seminar. Insurance
Certainly is.
And if the phrase insurance coverage and activism didn't put you to sleep, we're happy to do that seminar for you. But I'll move on to the next slide. Poison pills. Lots of poison pills adopted last year. Here's a breakdown of the different types of pills. Again, this is the subject of a totally different CLE. We wanted you to see the stats. Next slide. Since the great financial crisis, we have not seen this many poison pills adopted. Nearly double 2008 and more than double 2009 as companies market capitalizations became severely dislocated from intrinsic value between March and July of last year. Companies raced to adopt poison pills. I think we adopted 10 for public companies. We put another 15 or so on the shelf, which means they were ready to go in case of an emergency. But the boards truly believed, looking through the dashboard, not knowing how deep the pandemic was going to cut into market capitalizations, that an activist could swoop in and buy a control or something like control in the company without paying a proper premium to the rest of shareholders. Carl Icahn did it in Occidental Petroleum. The company's market cap dropped from 10 billion to a billion, and he bought 10% of the company. And then it went back up, and he did quite well. Probably his only good energy investment in the last 20 years. But a poison pill was adopted there. Other companies adopted poison pills too to avoid that happening. Next slide.
And a lot of these pills were put in place with a 1-year term, and it'll be very interesting, I think, to see any companies come back with renewals of their pills or updates to their pills during the 2021 season.
Yeah, Michael, that's what we did at Depomed, for instance, a 1-year pill.
Yeah, and that's fairly common because if you put in pills that sort of extend into perpetuity, it creates different kinds of issues on the litigation front, and with corporate governance issues and so forth. Although there's actually mixed academic research about the value of pills, and I'm not talking about pills to preserve NOLs. I'm talking about pills to that supposedly would be for entrenchment purposes. The reality is, I think that the academic research suggests that having a pill in place actually enhances shareholder value if a deal is actually done. But that's, as Lawrence says, that's for a different day and time. Let's take a look at some of the stages of an activist campaign and how these things usually come together.
Yes, and hopefully this addresses one of the questions that I saw come up in the chat, the campaign stages, and we'll get to that slide. But how do you become an activist target? This is even before the campaign stages begin. How do you know? This is what activists look like. Michael, can you go back a few slides?
Yeah, I'm trying. Somehow or another, this thing started moving on its own. There we go.
Okay, terrific. So this is the activist dashboard. If your total shareholder return is negative on a 1, 3, and 5 year basis, on an absolute basis and relative to your peers, you could be an activism target. That's what ISS and Glass Lewis look at primarily in determining whether to recommend for or against your board. It's how has the company been performing? If your 3 and 5 year look good and your 1 year looks bad, you could be a target. You could lose a few board seats. If 1, 3, and 5 look good, or they all look bad, but there's improvement on the way proactively, now you got a good story to tell. Annual meeting results, very important. Every year your shareholders tell you how you're doing. As directors, they tell management how they're doing. If you're doing say on pay, if you try to get equity compensation plans approved, you hear from shareholders on that as well. And you have to take that feedback. If the feedback is that 10 to 20% of your shareholder base or more are withholding or voting against, you should do some archaeology right away and find out what the source of those votes are. And you should think about how you fix that going into your next proxy season with several months of runway. Companies that persistently have those votes and the votes go unaddressed and the ISS and Glass Lewis feedback that you receive go unaddressed, activists pick that up and they will use it against you. You don't have to make all the changes that ISS and Glass Lewis and shareholders are asking you to make. You just have to make at least a record of having heard the feedback, considered it at the board and governance level, and considered making proactive changes to address the feedback that you're asking to consider.
Yeah, Lawrence, I would just add to that, that even if none of these factors apply sort of clearly to your company, you can be the subject of activism anyway. So I would just encourage all of you to take to heart the recommendations regarding getting prepared for this sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. And then other telltale signs are, long director tenures, particularly over periods of underperformance, capital misallocation, years of underperformance without any admission from the board and management team that they could have done a better job, and here's how they're going to do a better job. Companies that are intellectually honest generally have a better shot at avoiding activism, even if they're performing poorly. And all companies of all sizes have challenges. Lastly, where it's okay for directors to not own and management to not own 10% of every company that they're on, but companies should have policies in place to get to ownership targets to show the rest of your shareholders that there's skin in the game. When you have long tenure, bad performance, and lack of ownership by the board and management, that's a fertile ground for a shareholder activism campaign. Next slide.
I would add to that, your shareholder base needs to understand what the company's strategy is, because you're going to get a strategy statement from the other side, and engagement with your stockholders about what it is you're attempting to accomplish is critically important.
Correct. Okay, campaign stages leading up to a proxy fight where board seats are contested. So this all begins with the previous slide, which is, where's the idea? Where are the reasons why this is a target? And how can we unlock value? Once that's all settled, the activist will begin building a stake in the company. And oftentimes that's done quietly. They don't want to move the market too much. They don't want the company to know. They don't want their buddies to know. They want to build enough of a position called a toehold so that their presence is threatening enough that the company and other shareholders will listen to them. Activists will also try to hide their ownership as much as possible. They'll own shares through derivative securities, and they'll try to cloak themselves as long as possible so that when they show up, they can really pounce if they need to. There are other things that the activists have to consider in building a stake in the company, whether they're a group with other activists, whether they're ringing any HSR antitrust bells by virtue of the size of the stake they're building in the company, and whether they have competing interests in other companies that compete with their target company. And then along the way, there are securities filings that the activist has to make every quarter. If a shareholder investment fund owns more than $100 million worth of assets under management, they have to make a quarterly filing called the 13F filing, and they have to disclose their holdings. That's typically a pretty stale filing because you see it 45 days after the end of each quarter. Most notably, the activist will have to file what's called a 13D filing. So once an activist owns 5% or more of a company and has an intent to influence the board or management or business, they have to file with the SEC what's called a 13D filing. And that filing has a number of items in it. And the most notable item is the one called item 4, where the activist has to give a clear statement of its purpose for making the investment. And that's where you see how aggressive the campaign initially is going to be. Is it, we just intend to communicate with the board and management about the business? Or is it the board has underperformed, has not held management accountable, and we're targeting board seats? It can range, and that's a very important filing. The activist has 10 days after it crosses 5% and has that requisite intent to make its Schedule 13D filing. And oftentimes the activist will contact the company and say, I triggered my 13D obligation today. It's a Friday. A week from Monday, I'm filing a 13D. Let's settle. We got 10 days. Otherwise, it's going to be fireworks. We see that from time to time, and companies need to be on their toes for that and prepared. Engagement. I just alluded to how an activist may engage around a 13D filing by ambush, but more often than not, engagement starts privately. Private letters, meetings at investor conferences, one-off conversations with directors, intentional meetings with executives and other directors that are scheduled. Sometimes it's the portfolio manager that calls in, sometimes it's the analyst. Sometimes Carl Icahn just goes on to CNBC and says, my 13D is getting filed today. It ranges. But generally, when private engagement doesn't work, I'm sorry?
I'll forget about the police.
Okay. If private engagement doesn't work and the other authorities aren't called, then we will deal with public engagement. And the public engagement can take a lot of different forms, most notably the campaign website, the white papers, the public letters, press releases, statements to the media, and sometimes you get ambushes on investor calls. By the time a public engagement happens, you got to have your team ready in order to make sure that the market doesn't think you've been caught flat-footed. And after public engagement, there's normally a period of time to try to resolve these things. If they don't get resolved, then you're in a proxy contest. And in a proxy contest, like we mentioned earlier, you could be dealing with less than a majority of the board at stake, or a fight for the full board, higher standard. Sometimes there are fights at special meetings over M&A. There are other ways for shareholders to have their voices heard beyond a proxy contest. For board seats, they could look to collect proxies to withhold votes on management, and they could also look to collect proxies for other types of proposals about governance. Next slide. The typical timeline for a proxy fight is 3 to 4 months. It starts with the notice from an activist that they're going to be nominating directors. There's then a period of time where there's a negotiation. Sometimes it's about a month to 2 months of negotiations. If it doesn't go anywhere, the SEC requires both sides to clear a proxy statement in preliminary form before both sides can go out and solicit votes. There's generally a 45-day to 2-month period where a company is going to be soliciting votes and running their campaign. And the campaign consists of fight letters, press releases, letters to shareholders, making the case on both sides, specified investor decks and presentations to ISS and Glass Lewis, making the case why the company is great and the activist is terrible. ISS and Glass Lewis and institutional shareholders have a lot of influence over the outcome of these elections. That's why you're doing your archaeology on your shareholder vote in peacetime, so that you're not first engaging with 40% of your electorate when you really need them. And then, ultimately you go to your shareholder meeting. A word to the wise about these shareholder meetings. Normally 2 people show up to them outside of the board. It's normally the activist and the activist's proxy solicitor. These shareholder meetings, although they feel like they're going to be, arena events with gladiator fights, they last about 15 to 20 minutes and then they're over. All the fighting, all the air is released out of the balloon way before those polls open up. Matt, Michael, having lived through some of these, any comments? Or Michael, do you want to talk about litigation?
I'll talk about litigation, but Matt, do you have any comments before I do?
No, I think Lawrence summarized it well. We actually didn't make it to a vote in our case. We wound up settling a couple of times over the course of about a year. So, but the meetings are not interesting in and of themselves. That's for certain.
Well, yes, there are very few shareholder meetings, annual meetings that are that interesting in my experience. But yeah, litigation is a feature of approximately 30%, I think, of the proxy fights that go on. And there are, of course, different types of litigation that can go on. Lawrence mentioned the filing of a 13D. It's not just a function of the timing of the filing, but whether there's been a group that's been formed earlier than the filing, or whether the group is completely disclosed, whether the intentions of the group are fully disclosed. They're often exceedingly cagey in that initial filing. And indeed, I've seen some situations where the initial filing is on a 13G, and there's some question about whether that was a fair and robust filing. You can have violations of Section 14. You can have fights about whether or not the company nominations by the activist have been validly put forward. And there are all kinds of special situations. I've got a case now where we have a particularly regulated entity where the regulator has something to say about whether acquisition of a significant position in the company needed pre-clearance, and whether or not the shares were properly obtained under those circumstances. But those are fights against the activist. I think the overarching thing I would say about going after the activist with litigation is that it's important that you don't wait too long if you're planning to use that tactic in response to a governance fight. I don't always urge that you bring litigation, but if you're going to bring litigation, especially litigation to enjoin the activists from to correct proxy materials or something like that, you need to bring that early and you need to win, because if you don't bring it early, you're going to be up against the normal standards for temporary restraining orders and latches types of arguments. And the court's first question is, why are you here today instead of 6 weeks ago when the preliminary the definitive proxy was filed? There are also obviously lawsuits against the company and its board that are possible, and activists do bring these. Sometimes companies do little things to manipulate their stockholder meeting, like not hold them for a long time. And other times we've seen recent cases where the company sort of suddenly moved up the date of an annual meeting to squeeze out the ability of anyone to nominate consistent with the company's bylaws on advance notice. You may see litigation to dismantle structural defenses like pills or other things along those lines, to reverse board actions. But the most common kind of lawsuit we run into are books and records demands. And there are two different types. One's for a shareholder list, which are pretty routine, but more significant are books and records demands that appear to be preambles to shareholder derivative litigation or other breach of fiduciary duty types of lawsuits. And those are actually fairly important. All of this has an overlay of director and officer insurance issues, which, as Lawrence said, are very complicated and are often met with a denial of coverage from the D&O carrier on grounds that this is just a fight about corporate policy and isn't a covered claim. But the definition of a claim is typically a demand, it sometimes has to be in writing, but a demand based on alleged wrongful acts by the company or its directors and officers for monetary or non-monetary relief. And changing your corporate governance structure, to me, is a form of non-monetary relief, and we've had some success there. We've also had a number of forget about it. Finally, don't forget about the regulatory angle. Bedbug letters are a fairly common feature of these fights. These are letters to the SEC, to the proxy, to the people at the SEC who evaluate proxy statements, saying, or press releases or other 14A material where you can advise the SEC that you believe that the other side's materials are deficient for one reason or another. There are a lot of rules about this. Now, the SEC isn't going to act as a regulator. They're not going to come in and immediately create an enforcement fight against your activist or against you, because the activist is going to be doing this too. So they're not going to slap anybody with anything, but they do act as a referee and do work to get the other side to level the playing field. Ultimately, the SEC's goal is that by the time of the fight, everybody has a full understanding of everybody else's position, and the fight can be a fair one.
Yeah, Michael, on that last point related to bed bug letters, I would just add that they were very effective in the case of our hostile takeover attempt to get the other side to provide what we felt was much more kind of complete and accurate disclosure. So those were important for us.
Yeah, we use them all the time. Anyway, we should move on because I see that we're running out of time rather quickly, but
Breeze through it. I'll
gotten to
breeze
the
through it.
important part about advanced preparation, but go ahead, Lawrence.
Yeah, so look, hostile takeovers, we have a few slides in here on this. Again, subject of its own CLE seminar, but similar approach. Again, the end game here is someone wants to buy the company and take it private. It'll start with the non-disclosed market accumulation. Private approach is normally orderly manner without a public affair. But if and when the companies do not respond the way the activists want them to right away, you'll get a bear hug letter, which is a letter that says, if you do not accept at this price on these terms by this date, we're going to go public. Oftentimes, boards are now thinking about adopting poison pills. They're probably doing a little bit earlier when they see that there's a massive accumulation happening. And then what you will see more often is a proxy contest. The proxy contest generally isn't by the activists saying, put my people in the boardroom so I could sell the company to myself. That's a bad campaign theme. The normal theme is the company's board is not set up in such a manner to consider options to unlock value for all shareholders. We gave the board such an option. The board ignored it. Therefore, we need independent directors in the boardroom to be able to evaluate all offers, including ours. The activists have had success with that argument in the past several proxy seasons. Look at CoreLogic, look at Mac-Cali. There are a few other examples going on right now where offers that were rebuffed without the board creating the right defensive narrative, those boards have then gone on to lose board seats. In the Mac-Cali situation, there were directors with the last name Mac that lost their board seats. There's a playbook for these matters. The old playbook of hide your board and pray that the shareholder is going to go away worked in the 80s and 90s. In the early 2000s, it doesn't work anymore. There is a playbook that works. It's a more constructive one where you build a better narrative. And you can get to that same result that hide the board got the boards to for many years. Tender offers you don't see very many of because of the advent of poison pills. Companies are ready to stop tender offers. And there are other pressure tactics in the activist toolkit. Next slide.
So advanced preparation, I think the biggest single thing, and maybe Matt could speak to this just a little bit, is the need to have a response team that you've identified in place and active. Matt, do you have some experience with this?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most important thing we as lawyers, in-house lawyers, can do is be sure that we know who we're going to call when the time comes and do as much as we can in advance. And even I've learned from people like Lawrence and Michael and others that having a poison pill on the shelf is one thing, but having it fully negotiated and ready to be signed may be another that costs a business day or two. And that could be, 1, 2, 5% of your company that goes by the wayside there. So this is certainly, from my perspective, the most important thing we can contribute.
Lawrence, what do you have to say about a team?
Yes, well, if we could pry Matt away from being general counsel, he would be his own sphere on this slide. But generally, there is a law firm. If your regular outside counsel doesn't have the specialization, oftentimes a specialist law firm is brought in. That's a lot of times how we get involved. in these situations. In fact, there are a lot of companies in the tech and life sciences space who are enamored with their regular outside counsel and want to bring in non-threatening activism defense counsel who don't want the M&A work or the litigation work. And that's us. We work on these matters as specialists. Michael and I come in as activism specialists. We don't look for the other work, and that normally creates a good advisory ecosystem for lawyers that are working with the company. But a proxy solicitor is a big part of the team. They help collect votes. Without them, it's very tough to get your directors reelected. And they help forecast what your vote turnouts will look like, often with precision, rifle shot precision, as they would say in the courts of Delaware. PR firms are very important. Many of you probably work with PR firms that are regular peacetime PR firms. Sometimes they have specialists in-house, sometimes they don't. There are firms out there that specialize exclusively on crisis PR. They have the playbooks, they have big teams, they can hit the ground running, ready to go, working with the media, working with your shareholders, working with other constituencies to make sure that you're on point and you don't look flat-footed. Depending on the type of campaign, and it's most campaigns nowadays, there's an investment bank or a boutique advisory firm. Oftentimes when the topic is M&A, it's important to have some sort of financial advisor or someone with financial acumen to stress test the reasoning of the board and management team of why now is not a good time to sell, to show that you've done the independent analysis and you've had that analysis stress tested by a bank that's helping you put up the defense, gives you additional credibility and wherewithal to manage through these things. This is what the team looks like. Next slide. Preparing for a proxy fight. We've alluded to some of these throughout, and this is where the from the bylaws part of this presentation comes from. We wait until the last 5 minutes to make the title of the presentation make sense to everybody, but you've got to do a 360-degree financial self-evaluation, and you can look at slide 31 for more details on what this means. We talked about it earlier. You got to look at yourself through the lens of an activist. Someone needs to come in. We do this, bankers do this, PR firms do this. Someone needs to come in and write the activist letter or make the activist white paper presentation to the board and management, and then have a discourse about it, right? Here's what the activist is going to say based on current facts. How do you respond and how do you get out in front of it? Corporate governance analysis. And again, there are slides in here for more detail. We take as a benchmark the company's corporate governance practices in one column. In the next columns, we look at ISS and Glass Lewis, BlackRock, Fidelity, Vanguard, the top 10 shareholders. What are their policies and how does the company stack up? The better you stack up positively with ISS and Glass Lewis and your top shareholders' policies, the more likely you're going to have a good engagement with them if you've been proactive. If you're not stacking up, you better hope that your performance is good or improving at an improving rate. Otherwise, the governance is going to be blamed as the reason why there's poor performance. Do that analysis in real time. We help with that. Structural defenses. This is the flip side of whether your governance is shareholder friendly. These are your bylaws before you get to the ballot box. Do your bylaws give shareholders a lot of rights? If they do give shareholders a lot of rights, you want to make sure that around the edges, you have as much control for the board as possible. For instance, can the chairman of an annual meeting adjourn the meeting for any reason, even if you have enough shares present to have a binding vote? If you can't do that and you need to adjourn the meeting to try to convince a shareholder to get their votes in, you may lose directors, because if your bylaws don't say your chairman can adjourn the meeting, shareholders will sue you in Delaware court and say you had no authority to adjourn the meeting, and the vote stands. If it's written in your bylaws, it's a contract between you and your shareholders. If it's clear and unambiguous, you could do it. If it's not in there, a Delaware Chancery Court judge is going to say you acted outside of your authority as a director. So we look at those bylaws in peacetime and make suggestions, just like I just made, about how to give leverage to your board in a contested situation. There are 30 or 40 nuances that we look at in every bylaws. You cannot change your bylaws once you get a public letter or a private threat. You're now subject to a different standard. It's not the business judgment rule, it's an enhanced scrutiny standard. And if you start making changes to the rules of getting out of the locker room, once the activist has already started the game, you're going to find yourself in court. You could lose. Fix it in peacetime. Stock surveillance. This is what we have Proxy solicitor do. Watch your shareholder base closely. Investor relations. Work with your investor relations firms, the crisis firm, to make sure that you have all of your standing press releases ready to go. You can hit the ground running once there's a threat. Boot camp, kind of like this, except we do this for boards and management teams, and it's more interesting. And before COVID, it was over dinner and drinks and more lively, although Michael and Matt have been pretty lively. Next slide. In terms of a hostile takeover, I have 1 minute. Get your shareholder rights plan ready to go on your shelf, pre-negotiated with your transfer agent. If it is not pre-negotiated with your transfer agent, it might take you 3 or 4 days to adopt a poison pill, during which time the activist will probably have bought in the open market another 10% of your company, losing all leverage for your board. Your board should be prepared to meet on notice and frequently. These are fast-paced situations. Next slide. Communication strategy, same thing as preparing for a proxy contest. Hit the ground running with an array of standing press releases so the market thinks you're prepared and not flat-footed. Get your team put together well in advance. And with activism for board seats and activism to buy the company that's unsolicited, let your D&O carrier know right away. If you do not, good luck trying to shake money out of them. But we specialize in shaking money out of insurance companies. We love to do it.
I would just say, as we have to wrap up here, that a lot of this stuff needs to be done in advance. You know, if you have a good IR function, they should be engaging with your stockholders, especially your major stockholders, on a regular basis. You can assess how your stockholders are feeling about your governance, about your operations, and so forth. With D&O insurance, there are a lot of provisions of these policies that can be negotiated if you're up for renewal, and can, be adjusted in ways, often negotiated in ways that will be helpful in these situations. Having that advanced look at how your stock is performing and about, what the financial self-evaluation shows are things that can and should be done not after the threat exists, but well in advance. And we do a fair bit of this kind of work, as do other firms, to assist. The slides that we've put together include a deeper dive into a number of these points. And I'm sure that, as Lawrence will say here in wrapping up, that we do these analyses for companies all the time, and we're happy to do it if you're interested, or if there are additional questions that we didn't get to today, which we see there are quite a few. We're happy to have one-on-one discussions with you about your particular situation, your particular question. I apologize that we seem to have run a bit over, but Lawrence, any final words? Matt?
I would just say that kind of being well prepared, as you all are recommending here, allows you to be a sort of calming influence, especially for the CEO and the chair of the board, which is really important when the time comes. It's a very disconcerting situation, which can last for months. So I would take this advice to heart.
What Michael and Matt said.
If there are questions, be in touch, and Carrie will kick it back to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Vinson and Elkins.